Good morning. On behalf of the NC Chamber, welcome to COVID-19 Relief Resources for Small Businesses. I am Janelle Boyd with the NC Chamber. All attendees are muted to avoid any distractions during today's presentation. If time permits, we will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If you would like to submit a question during the meeting, you may use the question and answer box. Please do not use the chat box. You have the opportunity to upvote the questions you most want answered by clicking on the thumbs up for that question. The questions with the most votes will be answered first. A recording of today's webinar and any slides will be made available to you via email within 24 hours of the webinar. Now, I would like to introduce Peter Daniel Jr., Government Affairs Manager with the NC Chamber. Peter.
Thank you, Janelle, and good morning. It is my pleasure to introduce Thomas Stith, North Carolina District Director of the U.S. Small Business Administration. Thomas oversees an office that drives economic development by assisting local entrepreneurs start and grow businesses. He also directs the implementation of SBA programs related to accessing capital, business advising, and government contracts. Thomas also served as Chief of Staff to Governor Pat McCrory from 2013 to 2017, and a City of Durham Councilman from 1999 to 2007. A native of Durham, North Carolina, Thomas is a graduate of North Carolina Central University, earning a master's and bachelor's degree in business administration. Thomas, I'll turn it over to you.
Peter, thank you so much for that introduction. And Janelle, I appreciate your welcoming remarks as well. I'd first like to thank the NC Chamber for sponsoring today's event. I think it's very critical as we meet the challenge of this pandemic to have collaboration throughout North Carolina. Today, I thought it would be helpful to provide a general overview of where we are now with SBA's response to COVID-19, some of the initiatives that have been employed in the state, and have some discussion about what may be next. Just to put our conversation in context, at this moment, literally in Congress, there is debate on additional legislation that would provide additional funding for two of the major SBA initiatives. That's the Paycheck Protection Program and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program with its accompanying grant. If this legislation passes, and it is anticipated that it will provide additional fundings for these two initiatives. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan has paused at its current state in accepting applications because of the significant response. We are still processing accepted applications, but our anticipation is with additional funding that will be reopened. And as many of you know, the Paycheck Protection Program exhausted the $349 billion allocation that was made available through the CARES Act on March the 27th. So for context, we are all waiting and anticipating action from Congress for additional funding. But let's take a look at how we got to where we are now from SBA's response, and then discuss the programs in a little detail. And I really want to leave a good amount of time for question and answer, because a lot of information, and we are in the middle of a crisis. So we understand that small businesses are under duress at this point and want to provide what guidance we can. So let's first look at how North Carolina initially entered from an SBA perspective. Next slide. So on March the 18th, U.S. Administrator Jovita Carranza declared a full disaster in the state of North Carolina. And soon after, this was declared throughout the U.S. This is the first time a virus was designated as a qualifying event. This declaration by Administrator Carranza enabled eligible small businesses throughout the state to qualify for economic injury disaster loan. Unfortunately, here in North Carolina, and as a North Carolina native, I've experienced, and we've all experienced, the hurricanes that hit our coast or the forest fires in western North Carolina. But this is the first time in history, at least recent history, that all 100 counties were declared. If you can imagine that response and multiply that across the U.S., a significant event ensued. So now let's take a look at the three initiatives, two that we'll talk about specifically, but three that became available during this crisis. We'll talk in detail about the Paycheck Protection Program. I'll mention briefly about our Small Business Debt Relief Program, and also more detail about the Economic Injury Disaster Loan. For the Small Business Debt Relief Program, I just want to mention that because there may be existing SBA loan holders either on this call or that may listen at some point, and want you to realize that there is relief for existing 7A or 504 loans, our typical flagship loan programs. The SBA will pay 6 months principal and interest on these loans as a result of the March 27th CARES Act. But in detail, that's the Paycheck Protection Program and Economic Injury with its accompanying grant will be the focus of our discussion. So let's look at the Paycheck Protection Program and what that involved and where that is at this point. The Paycheck Protection Program was a part of the March 27th passage of the CARES Act. It provided almost $350 billion for small businesses, nonprofits, and including faith-based organizations. These loans last for 2 years at a 1% interest rate, but the key component of the Paycheck Protection Program, and really the theme, is to provide employers the ability to maintain their current staffing levels. Therefore, within the guidance for this initiative, there is a forgivable clause. If small businesses or nonprofits utilize at least 75% of their proceeds from the loan during the first 8 weeks after receiving those funds, that component, along with other eligible expenses such as utilities, rent or lease payments, those combined payments will then reduce the amount of loan, therefore making that forgivable. Again, the program is designed to provide not only operating revenue for the business, but more importantly, to provide the business the tool to maintain their employees, therefore the forgivable clause. So the Paycheck Protection Program clearly has been a key response. It's currently a part of the debate in Congress for additional funding. I thought it might be helpful just to give a brief overview of what has happened with the Paycheck Protection Program and some of the results here in North Carolina on our next slide. Nationally, as I mentioned, over $340 billion was provided through economic relief, and those loans are now being in the process funded. Over 1.6 million applicants were approved. Here in North Carolina, that translated into almost 40,000 applicants, $8 billion dedicated to applicants here in North Carolina. 74% of the loans were at $150,000 and below. As a part of the current legislation that is being debated, there is also a carve-out, if you please, for community development finance institutions, credit unions, smaller lenders, to attempt to address one of the concerns from the first round of the PPP or Paycheck Protection Program, and trying to ensure that all businesses had an opportunity to respond and have their application reviewed. As I mentioned, this has been an historic event. There's been tremendous demand. SBA, in a 14-day period, did 14 years worth of loans. And so just to signify the significant response. So the Paycheck Protection Program for nationally and North Carolina had very significant impact, but still a tremendous demand remains. Let's look at the Economic Injury Disaster Loan, its structure, and then its result here in North Carolina. As I mentioned, after the March 18th declaration of our entire state as a disaster, small businesses were then eligible in all 100 counties to participate and apply direct to SBA for Economic Injury Disaster Loan. With the Paycheck Protection Loan Program, your application as a small business would be direct with your lender, or whether that's a bank or a credit union. The thought process was to expand the outlets, if you please, for response for applicants. For the economic injury disaster loan, SBA is the direct lender in that initiative. And let's look at some of the components for the economic injury disaster and its accompanying potential grant. These loans can go up to $2 million. For small businesses, the interest rate would be 3.75% over a 30-year period. For nonprofits, 2.75%. After the passage of the CARES Act, an additional benefit became available, and that was the ability to request an emergency advance. This advance can be up to $10,000. It's based on the number of employees. The typical matrix is $1,000 per employee up to $10,000. And this is a grant. So regardless of the outcome of your full EIDL application, if you were reviewed and approved earlier in the process for the emergency grant, those funds do not have to be repaid. It is a true grant, regardless of the outcome of your EIDL full loan request. And so these loans are designed for operating expenses for the business, provide the needed cash support and revenue support during this crisis. Let's quickly take a look at some of the results to date from the economic injury disaster loan. Again, from a national perspective, over $5.5 billion, almost $5.6 billion to almost 27,000 businesses. Here in North Carolina, we had a little over 760 businesses approved, and that resulted in almost $148 million of support for businesses here in the state. The grant component, again, at a national level, about $3.3 billion to over 700,000 businesses. And here in North Carolina, almost 20,000 of those applicants and grants processed and approved for around $88 million. So now the question is, what's next? Where are we now with the pause in both of these programs because of the funding depletion, in particular for the Paycheck Protection Program and the amount of limited funding for EIDL. We are strongly encouraging small businesses to maintain connection to SBA during this time. And the website is displayed. That's sba.gov/coronavirus. Updates will happen once this pending legislation, and we, as I mentioned, anticipate its passage. Also on the Paycheck Protection Program side is to if you've applied, talk to your lender now to determine if your application will be moved forward to be submitted to SBA for the guarantee portion of the loan. Your relationship with a PPP is direct with your lending institution. SBA serves as a 100% guarantor on the loan. But to utilize this time now, because if your current or your bank that you have a relationship with doesn't anticipate, given their volume, forwarding your application, there are other SBA lenders that may be potential outlets for you. We maintain a list of those approved SBA lenders on our website. And so that's available at the North Carolina District site. That's sba.gov/NC. Another strong recommendation we have at this point is to engage our resource partners across the state. And let's look at the next slide, and that will give you some idea what that may mean for you as a small business owner. SBA partners with several strong resource partners across North Carolina, the small business technology development centers that are located at our university campuses, clearly now working virtually, but they are working literally with thousands of clients each week to provide technical assistance, not only to help understand SBA programs, but to provide that technical assistance if you in fact apply for a loan or have applied for a loan. We have 4 women business centers across the state: Asheville, Charlotte, the Raleigh-Durham market, and also Fayetteville. And in Fayetteville, we have a business center for veterans. We have 10 SCORE chapters across the state that we support. So I strongly encourage during this very short-lived, I hope, pause in these initiatives is to engage not only SBA, but our resource partners, so that you are prepared for what we anticipate will be additional funding for these initiatives. They can be very helpful and provide additional information and support as you work through the EIDL or the PPP process. So with that, we strongly encourage, once again, as I said, to use this time to prepare. The Economic Injury Disaster Loan and the Paycheck Protection Loan has the potential for additional funding. I know a lot of information at one point. So at this point, I'd just like to pause and to provide adequate time for questions and answers to today's participants. Again, I want to thank the NC Chamber for their leadership, providing SBA this opportunity to have a discussion and hopefully provide some valuable information as we move forward in this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. First question is it true that small businesses are competing with large organizations or companies with millions of dollars in assets for the same CARES Act funds?
For the PPP, well, for the payroll protection program and the economic injury disaster loan, you have to qualify as a small business. And these funds are available on a first come, first served basis. For the Paycheck Protection Program in particular, we did hear that response from our small businesses. And that is why at least the legislation that is pending now has a carve out, for the lack of a better word, around $60 billion that will be focused to lenders that work with smaller enterprises, such as your CDFIs, your community banks, your credit unions.
Thank you. Next question is, an attendee applied for the EIDL on March 20th. Says they ran their credit on March 24th and it's been stuck with the loan officer since then. They've called twice in the last weeks and they're not able to be provided with additional help or a way of moving the process along. Why is the process taking a month? Who has the ability to assist when they call the SBA? Those answering the phones are not able to help and only read the information on their screen.
Sure. The general response is typically, and when the EIDL was launched, the average proposed time, and this was based on previous disaster response, was 18 to 21 days for full processing. This has been a historic response. You have a situation where you basically have the entire country declared. And so there have been delays. SBA in particular has enhanced their human resources, literally individuals to respond. Initial phases, I talked to businesses that literally when they called, they were in the queue and they were number 1,500. I spoke with a business this week. They called and they said they had their issue resolved in 7 minutes. So I understand, and SBA clearly understands that we're in a crisis. We're in the middle of a pandemic, but it is because of the volume taking some time to process applications. It sounds like the individual caller, their application is in the processing mode, but just has not been completed yet.
Thank you. Next question is there any more info on North Carolina specific relief programs?
These would be the major initiatives in relation to SBA. I know just by participating in various webinars at the local and state level, I would encourage small businesses to look at their own cities, counties. There are some state level, I understand. Our North Carolina General Assembly is reviewing potential funding options during this pandemic. So there are other state and local initiatives outside of what SBA is providing, but these are the major initiatives from the Small Business Administration.
Thank you. Will the next round of SBA and PPP funding ensure that small businesses can get loans, including those who do not have a relationship with an SBA bank?
There's a very strong language in pending legislation to ensure broader access. The specific question is guarantee. And I would just say, and also to level set all small businesses, there are no guarantees. These programs are operated on a first come, first served basis, but from a policy point of view, the next round is specifically providing funding for lenders that have a more diverse and. Hi, this is Thomas. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
I
I
think
apologize.
you were cut off in the middle of the last question.
Right, the Zoom gremlins got me.
Yes.
It was a question about guarantee. I think, right as I said, I want to make clear that it is a first come, first serve initiative, both. And so while there are no guarantees, in particular with the Paycheck Protection Program, the pending legislation is designed from a policy perspective to try to provide additional access to firms that may not have been able to adequately access the loans during the first round.
Thank you for that, Thomas. The next question is, what can we do if we have not received or heard anything on the EIDL $10,000 grant?
I would suggest two things, and also say welcome to receive these questions. If callers send those into the chamber, and we can have staff follow up direct with you. As a general statement, there's a customer support number I can provide. Not only a number, as I referenced earlier in the webinar, that a lot more efficient now, and an email address. So it may be if the individual will provide their email to you, if you provide it to my office, I can have them follow up direct. As a general statement, they can call 817-868-2300, 817-868-2300, or 800-659-2955. It's 800-659-2955. Or the email address for disaster, the EIDL, is disastercustomerservice@sba.gov. But again, if you forward the individual's email address, I can also have someone in the district office work with you as well.
Thank you. Okay. The next question is, I am reading two dates that are important related to PPP loan forgiveness. Do we have to rehire within 8 weeks of being funded, or is it by June 30th?
I guess to give currently the June 30th date, it was in relation to the end time for the Paycheck Protection Program. If current legislation passes, I would imagine they will either change or reaffirm that time period, because initially the Paycheck Protection Program sunsetted June 30th of this year, but because of the funds exhausting, it de facto came to an end as far as applicants are concerned. The 8-week timeline, if you please, is designed to provide the small business the opportunity to take advantage of the forgivable clause. So the timeline is triggered once you receive the funds, and then there is an 8-week look on how those funds were expended. So the thought is your gross payroll, you would maximize, if you want to maximize the potential to be forgiven during that 8-week period. So and just to add, so if you have either reduced your staffing or had to have full layoff, the way to maximize the full forgivable clause is to bring back full staffing to have them on payroll during that 8-week period.
Thank you. For sole proprietorships, Are payroll taxes included or excluded in the computation of the loan?
That's a good question. In general, for the payroll component for a sole proprietor, and I believe it is literally Schedule C, line 31, is the net income. That's typically how a sole proprietor, unless you are being compensated on salary as a sole proprietor, and for all quote employees, the cap is $100,000 be able to realize. But typically, for a sole proprietor, your calculation for the PPP is your net income, and that would be multiplied by 2.5.
Okay. Is it possible to complete an application now so that we are in line for an EIDL loan when more funding is available?
The last time I checked, as I said, they will probably reopen that portal. My understanding is I don't believe the applications are still available. And that's why we're encouraging individuals to be aware and to check on that website. So I don't believe at this point you can. And so I'll stop there. I would talk to some of our resource partners. I know a lot of the resource partners literally downloaded hard copies of those applications. The only caveat is in second round, the question is whether there will be any changes to the data collected. And that's, we won't know that until we receive guidance on new legislation.
Okay. I own a 1099 business and cannot find any avenues that have grants or forgivable programs. It's a statement.
Right. Contractors or 1099 individuals are eligible for both initiatives. But again, you would not, as an example for the PPP, you would not be able to claim other 1099 individuals you utilize for your business. It would be, as I instructed earlier, it would determine your quote salary through that, typically through the Schedule C process.
Okay. The bank through which we applied for our PPP loan is a large bank, and they are struggling to tell us where our application is in the process. Do you have any guidance on how to determine whether we need to stay with the one application we have submitted or look for other institutions to submit again?
That the application is with your lender. So the initial assessment would be a candid conversation with your lender to get an understanding of where the potential, if additional funding is provided, where would your application be in their process to submit. You are able to obviously seek other lenders. You can only receive one PPP loan. So if you pursue another lender and are accepted there, you can A, withdraw from your current lender, your application, or B, if you're approved by another lender, your primary or your initial application will not be processed. So I think it calls for a very candid conversation with your lender to determine if where you are in their potential submission, if additional funding is provided.
Okay. If a business owner applied directly in the first round of SBA EIDL on April 3rd, will their application still be active for the second round of funds?
Sure. Yes, and those applications are still being processed on a first come, first served. The pause was because of the lack of, or the amount of funding based on, in comparison to the amount of response. So they're still being evaluated. So it would not be a need to reapply that process. They would be a part of the continuing process if additional funds are available.
Okay. Does the SBA plan to issue additional guidance on PPP loan forgiveness calculations?
We won't know until new legislation passes. I would assume there may be some new guidance because there are some nuances, as I mentioned earlier, on some of the carve out that they're trying to ensure there's a broader response. So that I would imagine there's going to be some additional guidance or new guidance, but I really wouldn't want to speak to that until we have a passed legislation before us.
Okay, next question. When will the money be released that has been approved?
That's an ongoing process. As I said, significant money funding has been approved. We are hearing from small business each day that on the PPP side, in particular, that those loans are being funded and funds distributed by the lending institutions.
Next question. We are a small restaurant/bar. We do not have enough business to stay open for takeout or delivery. We have been closed since March 24th. We have applied for the PPP loan and have our SBA number, so expect to get funds sometime next week. It will be very difficult to spend the money on payroll within 8 weeks if we are not able to open up until mid-May or the beginning of June. What should we do?
That program is designed first and foremost to focus on employees in the paycheck. To qualify for the forgivable clause, the expenditures, if you're funded next week, the following 8 weeks, you would need to have at least 75% of those expenditures dedicated to payroll. Now you can have 25% for your utilities, rent, lease payments. So to be able to access the full forgivable nature of PPP. So I would just be very diligent in assessing what your payroll costs would be if you meet that 70, to ensure that you meet that 75% threshold on expenditure of funds, and then you could use the other 25% for other allowable expenses. Again, I just would remind to also reach out to our resource partners and SBA in specific, but our resource partners as well. They can help with strategies moving forward.
Thank you. Is there any assistance for landlords whose tenants are not paying rent due to COVID?
There was discussion at the national level around that issue. I haven't seen any specific legislation yet around that, but you are eligible, as an example, for the economic injury disaster loan, which can be utilized for operating expenses. So while it doesn't specifically address a landlord-tenant scenario, you would, as a small business, be eligible for both the EIDL and PPP.
What assistance is available for LLC businesses that do not have employees and are not able to open?
Again, you are eligible, as a sole proprietor LLC for both initiatives. Clearly, with the PPP, because of it sounds like it's a one individual, you wouldn't have the as larger effect if you had employees, but you're still eligible for the EIDL as well. So those would still be my recommendations if you're looking at SBA funding.
Okay. Can bonuses be given to ensure we maximize the forgiven amount?
So I'm not sure about that. Can you make sure you send that question to me and we will follow up? Typically, it is their standard payroll, which would include health benefits, vacation benefits. On that specific question on bonuses, I'm not clear on the guidance, but I can follow up and have that answer for you.
Thank you. Okay. When does the 8-week period start? Is it the date we sign the loan docs or the date we receive the funds?
It's the date of distribution. So once you receive the distribution on the loan, the 8-week period begins.
Thank you. Interest expenses for other debt than just a mortgage or building will be allowed in the forgiveness calculation. I think that's the question. Will interest expenses for other debt other than the mortgage and building be allowed in the forgiveness calculation, i.e. a debt from a loan a couple of years ago?
Yeah, typically, and again, that's a little specific, but typically the allowables are lease and mortgage payments. So, if that's what they're describing, that would be allowable. Utility payments, and those really are the broad categories that, other than your payroll, that would be a qualifying expenditure.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Do small businesses who did not receive funding during the last CARES Act be automatically funded? There's confusing information from congressional newsletters that state anyone who submitted applications prior to April 16th would be funded. Other sources state otherwise. I think you clarified, but if you can repeat that.
Yeah, I would just caution and say there is no automatic funding with either program. If you applied for economic injury disaster loan and not have, as an example, received a denial, or that your application has been denied, they are under review. For the Paycheck Protection Program, again, I would talk with my lender to see where your application is within the process, but there are no guarantees. So I haven't seen in part of the new legislation that would speak to folks that are pending being guaranteed funding. That might be a statement that's being misread.
Understood. Are EIDL loans eligible for forgiveness?
Not the full economic injury disaster loans. Those loans are for up to 30 years, and 3.75% is the rate for business, small business, 2.75 for nonprofits. The component of an EIDL that does not require repayment is the emergency grant that can be requested as a part of the application. And that grant is up to $10,000, and the matrix for review is $1,000 per employee, up to $10,000. So it's really a grant, so it's not considered a loan, but that is the component of EIDL that would not be required to be repaid.
How is the SBA processing the EIDL applications as they come in?
It is first come, first serve. So the process is ongoing based on the applicants that have been received. Since the portal has been paused because of the limited funding, no additional applications are being accepted at this time. But those that were already in the queue are being processed on first come, first serve basis.
How do you verify the status of your SBA EIDL if you have an application number?
Those with the information that I provided earlier, and I can say that you could either utilize the two call-in numbers for customer service or the email. The two call-in numbers, one is 817-868-2300, 817-868-2300. The other access number would be 800-659-2955. 800-659-2955, or either via email is disastercustomerservice@sba.gov.
Thank you. I own an LLC and I am the only employee. It is my understanding that EIDL is based on the number of employees. So does that mean I could only receive $1,000?
That's correct. It is the grant portion of EIDL. Now, keep in mind, the full EIDL is typically based on your operating costs. But it sounds like they're speaking to the grant portion, the emergency grant. And so if it's one individual, it would be, if approved, $1,000.
Okay. Can you explain how the forgivable amount can potentially be reduced?
Yes. And that sounds like they're asking about the Paycheck Protection Program initiative. The forgivable portion, and I guess they mean the loan reduced by the forgivable portion, that would be, again, once funds are provided to the applicant, the 8-week period after those initial funds are distributed. If the applicant spends at least 75% of those proceeds for payroll costs, but you have to have a minimum of 75% toward payroll. The other 25% you may utilize for utilities, lease, mortgage payments, or you could have the whole amount of expenditure toward payroll, but at least 75% toward payroll. And then say you did 25% in utilities and lease payments. That combined expenditure would then be the forgivable portion of the loan. So that amount would be what would be the amount that the loan would be reduced by. The balance then would be on that 2-year 1% term.
Okay. What are the requirements to apply for the EIDL if your business has received funds from the PPP?
You are eligible for both. You may receive an EIDL and a Paycheck Protection Program. The key thing to remember and keep in mind, you cannot use the proceeds for the same use of expenditure. So Paycheck Protection Program, as we've discussed, is clearly designed a majority for payroll. You could not then use the EIDL, although standalone allowable use for EIDL is payroll, part of your operating expense, but you could not use the subsequent EIDL loan for payroll costs. They would have to be for other allowable expenses, such as debt service or mortgage payments, those type things, but not, you couldn't use them for the same allowable use.
Okay. As a small business owner tenant, is there a page on the SBA site to view which NC businesses, aka landlord, received the SBA loan?
Can you repeat? I'm not clear what their question is. Can you repeat that?
As a small business owner, the tenant, they want to know, is there a page on the SBA site to view which North Carolina businesses have received the loan?
No, that type of data is, to my knowledge, not available. And we've tried to provide just general data from our SBA headquarters, but there's, to my knowledge, not a page available for a view of loan distributions to various landlords now.
Okay. We pay rent annually. Are we able to pay the next year's rent and use the entire amount towards the forgivable portion?
Well, in general, because that's clearly a specific scenario, and it sounds like that's a paycheck protection because that is only initiative that has a forgivable component. Remember, you have to have at least 75% of your expenditures during that 8-week period look to payroll. If you dedicated 100% toward rent, whether it was within that 8-week period, and I'm not clear on guidance on whether you could even do a year's worth, you wouldn't be eligible because you wouldn't have met that 75% threshold if you utilized it for 100% for rent payment.
Okay. The U.S. Treasury website posts FAQs on the PPP program. The FAQs list was updated as recently as today. Do you know if this list is updated in response to lenders and borrowers' questions submitted to the SBA?
It is. I thought I was going to get a question about something been updated, and I was going to say I've been on town halls all morning, but um, that is another source. SBA has FAQs. The Treasury site, both sites constantly update, and they are based on questions just like we're receiving today. And so that's another source for information on questions that may be similar to small businesses across the country. So the Treasury site is a valid site as well.
Okay. Do you recommend having a separate bank account to specifically track expenditures made with PPP funds?
I really would. I was on a webinar, I believe, yesterday with a small business center. Those are located throughout our community college system here in North Carolina. And I thought it was an excellent recommendation to do that because there will be, in particular for the forgivable clause, a process that the bank has to assess how those funds were expended. So I think it is good guidance to have a separate account for candidly for both, and that way it makes it much cleaner process to evaluate. But for the Paycheck Protection Program in particular, because you want to ensure that you're qualifying for the forgivable clause with your expenditures during that 8-week period.
Okay. There was a shocking report on National Public Radio yesterday about how much of the funds under PPP had been given out to what appear not to be small businesses such as Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. That report also indicated that preference was given for large loans by the lenders, not first come, first serve. The amount given to those businesses was huge. I am assuming that there will be a full report available under the Freedom of Information Act concerning the exact names of the recipients of PPP funds when those applications were submitted and when those funds were distributed.
I would imagine so, and I have a strong policy of not commenting what appears in the press, but I do know that from our experience, we are receiving applications from the lenders on a first come, first served basis. I have seen those national stories, and that clearly has drawn a significant amount of attention. So I would imagine that there will be a very strong oversight and overview of these both initiatives. And that's why on the last question, I think it's very valuable, not only for the larger company, small businesses, but small businesses in period, to have proper protocols in place because they're clearly with the significant amount of funding, there is going to be oversight.
Thank you. If the governor does not lift essential business orders, putting the business beyond the PPP deadline, what would the best course of action be to return the funds and reapply for the loan again?
I know it's counterintuitive, but these funds are designed to provide, and that's why for the Paycheck Protection Program, it's literally named Paycheck Protection. It is designed for the majority of the funds to allow the business to either maintain or return individuals to receive a paycheck. So certainly, the business has to make its own decision on expenditure of funds if they receive them. But as we have seen with the first round of funding, these initiatives are depleted quickly. One, two, they have time periods. So I don't think the questioner would want to speculate what would happen down the road for a potential initiative for those companies that return the funds. So they're going to have to make a decision if they want to expend those funds or existing employees to qualify for the forgivable nature, or in a case where you've had to separate employees, those individuals back or others to trigger the forgivable component of the program.
Okay. And the last question in the Q&A box is, what is the best and most current resource for outlining the forgiveness guidelines?
I think either site that we discussed earlier, obviously SBA, and you can see a full description of the existing initiatives on sba.gov/coronavirus, sba.gov/coronavirus. The Treasury site, as we mentioned a moment ago, in addition to the SBA site, the Treasury site, and I believe that's Treasury Cares, has a detailed Q&A section. It also has the interim final rule that we are guided by and provide guidance. So both of those sites, both SBA and the U.S. Treasury site, provides it more detailed information.
Thank you. Oh, we have a few other questions that popped up. So we have a few minutes. If the total amount of the PPP is not all spent on payroll, rent, or utilities, does it need to be returned, or can it be paid back with the 1% interest?
That's correct. If you make the qualifying threshold of 75% to payroll, 25% for other allowable uses, if there's still a balance for the loan, that is what will be amortized at that 1% interest rate due 2 years out. So that you don't have to return the funds that did not qualify for the forgiveness clause. That would turn into a loan that would be paid back under those terms.
Okay. The unemployment funding from the federal government is counterintuitive to rehiring employees when the unemployment payments are greater than payroll. Is there consideration of changing PPP guidelines to correlate to state orders?
Yeah, I have not seen any language in the legislation. I'm aware of that comment, but in the current pending legislation, I'm not aware of any language that changes that guidance.
If we are an essential business, we obtain the funds from PPP, but after the 8 weeks, we continue having problems with revenue, what is the next thing for us to do?
I would also explore the economic injury disaster loan if they have not applied for that. As we mentioned earlier, small businesses are eligible for both the PPP and the economic injury disaster loan. So I would suggest applying for that as well.
Okay. I just checked my bank balance, and last night the SBA deposited $8,000. Great. What is this for? We have 8 employees. I applied for the EIDL and have not heard anything.
That to me sounds like they have received the emergency grant portion if they have 8 employees and received $8,000. So they have received the emergency grant. That evaluation takes place early in the process of the full evaluation of the EIDL, and they are therefore received those funds, and their full application is still under review. And so that, unfortunately, as we mentioned earlier, that is taking time. I'm not sure when they applied initially, but they're still under evaluation for their full EIDL, or for the loan component of the EIDL.
Okay. If an employer receives a PPP loan, is it permissible for the employer to pay employees a salary even though the employees have not returned to work?
They would have to be on the business's payroll. So if they are fully separated, and this is obviously an HR issue, if they are fully separated, they would have to officially be on their payroll and receive that paycheck. If they're still on the business's payroll, if you please, then they would just pay that paycheck. But they would have to officially be on that small business's payroll because those records are going to be assessed at the end of that 8-week period to determine if thresholds were met to trigger the forgivable clause.
Okay, see what time is. Can you explain the qualifications for SBA bridge loans?
Yeah, we don't get many of those questions, and I literally had general discussion with my lending specialist this morning about that. But the bridge loans are designed for existing customers. They have existing relationships with banks and SBA. They are up to $25,000, and the thought is that they are a potential resource while you're going through the economic injury disaster loan process. We have just, as I said, we had some virtual conversation this morning about it. It's just because of the significant demand at your financial institutions, we are just not seeing that pursued at all. The resources are human capital resources are being dedicated to the Paycheck Protection Program, but on the site that I mentioned earlier, the sba.gov/coronavirus, there's additional information about bridge loans, but we have not seen activity around that.
Okay, we'll take one final question. Our application for the EIDL grant was an express application. Would we still be in consideration for the EIDL loan, or would that be a separate application?
I'm not sure on what they mean, express. If you could just forward that, I'd like to follow up with them direct, because it's, you know, the only difference in the EIDL, the initial funding for EIDL or application process did not have the benefit of the emergency grant. That only became available after the March 27th passage of the CARES Act. So they may be mentioning that. They should have gotten correspondence to, although it sounds scary, if you applied before the advance was available, to reapply to ensure you were able to be considered for the additional benefit of the advance. It would not disrupt your position in the review queue, but it also provided the business the opportunity to have the benefit of that emergency advance. So it sounds like that's potentially what they're talking about, but if you could forward that, they have an email contact. I'll make sure someone follows up just to make sure that's clear and that's what they're asking.
I will do that. Okay, we are closing to the 12 p.m. hour. So I would like to thank you all for attending today's presentation on COVID-19 relief resources for small businesses. We hope you found today's content valuable. You will receive a brief survey of the webinar via email. We would appreciate any feedback you can provide to allow us to improve these sessions. Again, the recording of today's webinar and any slides will be made available to you via email within 24 hours of the webinar. Thank you. Stay safe and healthy during this time. Thomas, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I want to again thank the NC Chamber for their leadership around this issue, and welcome the opportunity for SBA to partner with you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.